I want to discuss science and humanities. It's quite a broad theme. I appreciate that, and I can hardly cover it in any detail in 30 minutes or so. But I do want to suggest that they're indissolubly connected. That does sound like a truism or even a papal banality, but I think that it merits examination. And I want to leave you at the end with one major question, even if I haven't informed you about anything. The question will be, can you identify the creativity and beauty in your own work, whether you're scientist, artist, humanist, whatever? Because I think that creativity and beauty are the linking factors between science and the humanities. So after those introductory remarks, I'll turn to my presentation, and here it may come in a moment. I shall pause a moment so that anybody who doesn't see the presentation can let Chrissy know, and we can sort that out. That's a reassuring silence, so I take it that all is well and I can proceed, which I will do. I'm really talking about human affairs, am I not? And human affairs are immensely diverse, and I find immensely entertaining, as is this wheel of nostalgia, which you will find in Vienna when you go to the amusement park there. And without being facetious, I think that human affairs are indeed entertaining. And the little cars that go round on the wheel of human affairs are all there. Major efforts, major areas of human endeavour encapsulated in a single word in each car. So I've set myself quite an ambitious task, really, if I try to talk about this, but here goes. These affairs, which you're all well familiar with, and some of you are deeply experienced in, are on the left. The tools that we as humans use to engage in these affairs and make progress in them are listed here. These are some of them. I don't claim any of this is a comprehensive listing. That would be absurd, but it covers most of the major areas, I hope. So we have tools of morality and consciousness and spirituality and communication, and we're familiar with all these almost from birth. And the attributes we have which allow us to use these tools are, again, equally familiar things which we know from birth in various forms, which we're trained to develop, which I hope most of us share: playing, happiness, self-awareness, logical thought, handling numbers. It's an immense diversity of attributes that characterize what we do and how we think. And when I look at this set, and I do tend to think in sets sometimes, thanks to the Venn diagrams that you're all familiar with, I ask myself, is there a set of these tools or attributes which is peculiar to any of those affairs on the left? Can we reduce any of this collection to a subset which is specific to any term on the left? Well, I suggest that we can't. I've thought about it very shallowly, and I cannot find a subset of these things which relates to any one of those things on the left only or in part. And that makes me think that no matter what affair we're engaged in, we're using the same tools, the same attributes to handle them. And the best practitioners of these affairs are the ones who use all these tools and all these attributes. And of course, that applies to everybody here today. And I hope that is not seen as flattery. It's not intended as flattery. I've no need to flatter anybody. So I have these naive theses as I talk to you. They're complementary, humanities and science, and there's creativity and beauty in both of them. They're linked by beauty and creativity. And as I go through my 30 minutes or so, I hope to remind you, emphasize to you that beauty can be revealed or created, and that all creativity is to some extent constrained, and that these are things which are shared across both the sciences and the humanities. My direct question to you, which I will repeat at the end because I do want to leave it in your heads: can you recognize the creativity and the beauty in your own work, whatever you do? Can you recognize it? Because if you can, you may well be able to communicate better with people on the other side, if I put it like that. You may strengthen the bridges between humanities and science. And that's very important, particularly when we want to engage young people in one or the other, and we want to avoid the polarization of thought that so often starts in young life. So the question perhaps then is there a gap? Well, it's a trivial question, and my answer is pretty trivial. Look up science, and you'll see something like this. Look up creativity, look up humanities, particularly humanities, and if you're lucky, you'll find something like Ray Lawrence's amusing depiction of the work of those in humanities. Ray Lawrence is in the University of Kent, and I've given you the mention of him as a source, not because I particularly wish to highlight him or any of the other references I give you, but because I realize that once this thing is recorded, it becomes a matter of public accessibility. And I think it's important to give credit where there is possibility to do that, and also to give sources where there's something slightly contentious. So I suggest that there is a gap, at least in common perception, between science and humanities. Science seems to be about things and the caricature of this fellow in his white coat and his test tubes, an outdated caricature, but it still exists. Humanities is about thinking and doing artistic things, cultural things, language, all those things that connect us. But there is a bridge between the two, given the human propensity to polarize thought. So, given that there's a gap, given that there are perceived differences, let's turn to some practicalities. And the first one is perhaps science is on top rather than on tap, as Winston Churchill noted. It can at first sight look as if science is on top. There's an emphasis on STEM education and training, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Scottish Government is very strong on that. And I just mentioned the Scottish Government. I'm sure that the feature applies to other governments and other nations as well. Strong emphasis on encouraging STEM. So science may well look on top sometimes. However, you could also ask the practical question, are humanities on top? And at first sight, you might think they are. If we look at the degrees that MPs held about 10 years ago, I have lost the source of this diagram. As you will see, it is unattributed. If we look at that diagram, we see MPs are dominated by those in the humanities. Science degrees and technical subjects come very low down the list. 17% of MPs had STEM qualifications as opposed to 46% of the Universal United Kingdom graduate corps. So there is a feeling that the legislature is dominated by the humanities, and that science is indeed, as Churchill noted, could be on tap rather than on top. However, if we look more into the contemporary press and the media and events, we find a more threatening situation for humanities. Here is a quotation which I've given the reference at the bottom, which rings alarm bells for the humanities, does it not? And over the last few years, those alarm bells have continued to ring. And I won't go in detail. The war against humanities, a crisis in the creative arts, humanistic disciplines under pressure. Humans need the humanities, ultimate value of humanities. Aberdeen closing its modern languages. East Anglia cutting arts and humanities. Even in America, the same threats are seen by those engaged in liberal arts departments. Biggest attack on arts in living memory. So the signs are not good. And it's very hard to find anything to refute the arguments of the Oxford historian Keith Thomas, who about 13 years ago pointed forcefully to the weakness in the position of the humanities. Now, that is no cause for joy, not even to those who are dyed-in-the-wool, focused, obsessive scientists. Scientists on the whole do actually care. For example, in our own MASTS newsletter, we get invitations to contribute or apply for positions of artist in residence in the European Marine Board programme. That's good. There's a combination of art and science there, which is being actively promoted. My own Institute of Physics has had articles on why the arts matter, arguing forcefully that they do matter, that they should be defended. And to take a rather nice example, if you care to take a look at the SAM's website with the almost eponymous Sam Jones, who works there, and his little website, he will demonstrate, or he does demonstrate very nicely at the individual level, how a young scientist can care about the arts and about seeing the beauty in things of all sorts. So there are heartening pieces of news in this spectrum of humanity gloom. And even back to the days of C.P. Snow, we're seeing something about the need to humanize the scientist, as Snow put it, which I've just touched on, and simonizing the humanist. Now, those of you who are a little younger than me or a lot younger than me may not know what simonize means. It refers to a car polish, which used to be popular, let's say, in the 1960s. So C.P. Snow was actually arguing that the humanist should be polished in the sense of being aware of science and valuing it and not demeaning it. And that's quite important. He argued that science is beautiful and vital for us all, not just for the scientists, not for the technicians, not for the technicalities of making barbed wire or motor cars and things. It was more than that. And that was argued in his notion of the two cultures. So there are the gentlemen, there are the two cultures. In 60 years since Snow published that, we have made some progress, but I suggest we have not made enough. Here, for example, is David Sibic, who was director of posts after 1989. A coherently expressed, well-experienced person, admitting that ministers and civil servant officials who took the greatest responsibility for decisions of the post office at that time did not have technical expertise. They relied on a technical expert group. This is not encouraging for those who believe that science should be at the center of thought and decision making, because already we're seeing here, back in the 1990s, the idea really that the expert scientific advice is on tap, that the decisions and the laws are being made by those who are on top, and they are not scientists, and that was exemplified by David Sibic. It's worth watching the Post Office inquiry for an insight into the way that society works. More recently, we've had the COVID advice to follow the science. And it has been quite coherently, cogently argued since that following the science was a euphemism for shifting the blame onto somebody else. Even the Daily Telegraph, which is a conventionally supportive medium for the establishment, was prepared to publish the thought that humanities-trained politicians and civil servants didn't really understand what they were looking at, that they didn't really understand anything about modelling. Now, this is a gross oversimplification. I've met humanities-trained people who understand very well about modelling, but it is something which needs to be encouraged actively and always. And the most alarming thing that I discovered was that Eton, from whom many of our governing people are drawn, or from which many of our governing people are drawn, hosted its first ever STEM symposium in 2020, only 60 years after Snow advocated greater knowledge of science among those who use the humanities to govern the rest of us. So we cannot pretend that the journey towards the unification of the two is by any means finished. There is a long way to go. Science, of course, can go so far, and I suggest, I don't think I'm right necessarily, I'm very certainly incomplete, that a lot of us who are in science work on inspiration. We work inevitably on logic, and we work on evidence. And we engage in a merry-go-round in our brains, swapping thoughts between these three areas in all sorts of combinations, in all sorts of manners. And by using this, we eventually get to some sort of truth. But Leavis, F.R. Leavis, who was quite a critic of Snow's, he emphasized, and one has to agree with him really, that science operates or should operate within moral and human values, and that's important. We leave behind us the depressing spectacle of the chap Haber, who invented the nitrogen fixing process and who also dealt in poison gas in the First World War. Science permits all sorts of things, but it doesn't mean we should do them. So science is not enough. It cannot come up with the moral obligation, thou shalt not kill. We need the humanistic things as well. And of course, I've grossly simplified it here, but that's the best I can do in the time available. Do we have stereotypes? I think we do have stereotypes. The scientist is still seen as cool, objective, logical, methodical, and conventional, working out the inevitable truths of science in a sort of plodding bus route that goes from one place to another and arrives at a destination. That view is still too often heard. Whereas on the other hand, the artist, lovely, lively, colourful lady, wearing ghastly glasses, warm, subjective, intuitive, colourful, creative. This is a common perception. And I feel that this dichotomy that you're looking at still pervades thought, and to some extent, still, despite many, many commendable efforts in education, pervades education too. So I mentioned creative there, and I commend to you most enthusiastically a recent magazine published by the Royal Society of Edinburgh. It's their regular magazine, and it popularises and promotes the Royal Society of Edinburgh to the rest of us. And it's very fine. It gives an insight into Scotland's creative and academic mind, particularly the academic minds. And in this issue, which was published in the winter of 2023, Catherine Stieler gave an insight into the unlocking of creativity. I thought, oh, that's interesting. Let's see what they do with this, unlocking creativity. We shall learn about what is art, what is creativity. We did. It was a good issue, and there were comprehensive, cogent articles from people who argued about artistic creativity, musical creativity, the importance of architecture in helping to form society, and many other themes. It's a good read and it's stimulating. It does have one drawback from my scientific point of view, in that it didn't really define its basic term of creativity. I looked to it for that, and I couldn't really find a definition of creativity. But of course, it wasn't aimed at that. It was aimed at telling us how creativity may be unlocked. In 18 mentions of the word, there was one application to science. And I was hoping, unreasonably, I think, I would hear something about the creativity of surveys, of engineering, of cytology, mathematics or physics, of chemistry or deep sea surveying. All these things require creativity, but they weren't there. So they weren't unlocked in that particular issue, which dealt more with the artistic, humanistic side of creativity. But I got some comfort when I was casting around on the internet for images to entertain you with. I got some comfort from the undergraduate physics laboratory in Oxford, in the Clarendon laboratory. And I looked at this long familiar scene from 60 years ago of an undergraduate laboratory, and I thought how wonderfully it had been enhanced by the artwork on the wall. And I thought, here then is a place where they study the objectivity and the inevitability of science, and they combine it with the freedom of expression and the creativity of at least art, if nothing else. And they probably wear earphones like I'm wearing, so they probably enjoy a bit of music as well. Which leads me on to creativity. Now, here's a wonderful sculpture which I devised. There's a green cone. There is a grey blob, a grey sphere of granite on top, and suspended above is a red stone sphere. It's a very simple and primitive sort of sculpture, composed of 3 heavy pieces of matter, but it don't work. You cannot realize such a structure. You're not allowed threads, you're not allowed balloons. I said it was stone. You can't avoid gravity, so you cannot realize that concept. It's very easy to create things that cannot be made. They're created in your mind, but they're not made in reality. And I think this applies to a lot of human endeavor. And here, for example, is the girl with the earring in oils, a watercolor which looks a bit like Venice, and a rather cheerful acrylic. And anybody who wanders around art galleries will usually find it very easy, glancing at a painting, to think, oh, that's watercolor, that's oil, that's acrylic. There's something about the mediums which defines the creativity. You are not free to create the subtle gradations of watercolor when you apply acrylic and oils, or if you are, you have to do a lot of work to make it work. There are differences. There are obvious constraints. Same when you come to sculpture. If you look at this Chinese jade working, God knows how long it took to work this extremely hard material into this intricate design. It's substantially different from the plaster of Paris gnomes that I hope none of you have in your own gardens. There are constraints embedded in the material which determine how the final creation will turn out. Same with the Forth Bridge. Many people have learned to find this beautiful. Even those with no scientific or engineering soul can look at this and gaze upon it with wonder, because it has a form, it has a function, everything works, and there is a beauty they have learned to appreciate. But the constraints are there all the time. Gravity, engineering, strength of materials, all these things are present in that structure. They're not seen by most people, but they're there. When you come to this piece of woodblock printing, put my brain back in here for a moment. This is a woodblock from the Japanese artist Hiroshige. And very fine it is too, but it's distinct from many other forms of art because it's a woodblock. And I digress slightly to emphasize that in this particular version I've shown you, this is called the Wounded Knee version of the picture. Why? Because the people who carved the blocks made an error on the knee, which I've circled. And after that error was recognized, the knee was corrected, and this version came out instead. So the original version had a dirty knee. This one has what's called a wounded knee because although it's been repaired, it's a little wounded. And the backdrop was altered so as to highlight the snow on the houses. Both versions are deemed universally beautiful by those who love art. And yet they're slightly different. So this introduces the idea that beauty has got loose constraints on it. There may not be a unique version of beauty, except when you come to the scientific beauty embedded within this simple equation between energy, matter, and the velocity of light, where, as far as we know, and I say that very carefully, that E equals mc squared. It does not apply in the form that E equals mc to the 2.1. This is a very tight beauty, and as far as we know, it is unique. You are not free to modify this in any way whatsoever. So there is a tight constraint on the creation of beauty, and there is a loose constraint. Here's the Adachi Garden in Japan, which many consider to be the pinnacle of Japanese garden creation. This cannot be a fixed version of beauty because it deals with plants. Plants grow, the rain falls, the leaves blow, the wind blows, the day comes and goes, the light alters. This is never the same, and yet it's always the same garden. It's always seen as a beautiful garden. So here we have what you might term a continuously variable beauty which has been created. Music. Mozart wrote music for a piano with a limited number of octaves. I forget how many. The modern grand piano, I think, has about an extra octave. So the creation of music has now expanded from Mozart days. We can have higher notes and lower notes, I imagine, than we could when Mozart played. And this, of course, with the scientists' logical extension of things, suggests that if only we could get God to give us his piano or her piano, depending on your viewpoint, we could have an infinite number of keys extending to the lowest notes of the universe, extending one cycle of the universe's existence, right up to the highest frequencies, the unimaginable frequencies that exist within the elementary particles. And what a range of music we could have out of that. But it's no good because we can't realize this sort of creativity. It's there in potential, but it cannot be realized. I mentioned language earlier. Now, language, of course, you have to learn to appreciate language. I find this particular little quatrain from Edward Fitzgerald rather delightful because it says something about the inevitability of the passage of time and the inability to go back. And that in itself is an eternal truth, which is particularly beautiful and rather well expressed here. That's just me. You may find it just banal and rather trite, but makes the point that beauty is a matter of taste. The language in which you express thoughts, and this is paying a tribute to David's language as a barrier to communication speed chat, I must admit. If you go to another language, here's a bit of Russian that I always liked because it appeals to the small bit of the romantic in me. It describes a horseman riding it late at night. And without bothering you with the actual pronunciation, what you see here is 3 beats to the line and 2 rhyming couplets. The beats are in red, the couplets are here and here. And it flows beautifully in the original, and it describes the Gothic image of the horseman riding dark and late under the moon. But if you put it into English, it's really rather plodding. It's a straightforward factual account. Just ask the question, who's this guy on the horse riding along in the dark? There is a loss of beauty. So the expression of this was constrained by the language in which it was written. Same for Chinese. Here's some Chinese, which I don't pretend to understand at all in any transliterative form. Here's one English translation. What you're looking at here is not so much a piece of prose as a piece of allegory. Everything in these Chinese characters is an allegory for going high in order to get a wide view. And that's all it's about. And no amount of words or translations can really go beyond that essential beauty that a wide view gives you a greater insight. Now, science, of course, can add to natural beauty. I've been very aware of this, and I think many people who work in the marine field, which is what many people in Mars do, will know this, that science adds to natural beauty. Here is Hokusai's Great Wave picture. Now, the interesting thing about Hokusai's Great Wave is that it's beautiful, it's interesting, it's active, it's dynamic, it shows the human condition, the frailty of the poor souls in the boat about to be engulfed by the wave. So in that sense, it says something eternal. It is also based, although he didn't know it, upon the technicalities or the beauty of the Navier-Stokes equation which govern fluid motion. And it's those equations too which lie behind these beautiful atmospheric patterns, which you can sometimes see even in our own skies here in the United Kingdom, where one layer of air moves over another slower moving of air below, or vice versa. Anyway, there is a difference in flow speed between the layers. And if conditions are just right, you can get these beautiful repetitive waves in the sky moving along at the interface between the 2 different speed air layers. And these are called Kelvin-Helmholtz instabilities, familiar to most of you who are in the marine research field. And these can be understood because they are just the result of solving the fluid dynamics equations. So what you see in the sky can be replicated in the laboratory. There's a chap called Adrien Lefauve, and I had the privilege of assessing his work on one occasion for UKRI. That's a matter of public knowledge, so I'm not confiding anything there. And it was beautiful. In his hydrodynamic laboratory, a tank of water in a room in Cambridge, he can create those things that you saw in the sky. He can understand those things in terms of the Navier-Stokes equations, which to most of us are quite impenetrable. And as a result, you get these objects of great beauty, in truth, which echo the beauty we have seen both in the sky and in Hokusai's original painting of a wave. So this leads me on to the idea that science can add to our appreciation of nature and to beauty and humanities, everything, in a rather unique way. Here's a picture of Crocus speciosus, subspecies Xantholimos. Doesn't that sound impressive? I sound almost like a botanist. What Crocus speciosus subspecies Xantholimos actually means is that it's a crocus you're looking at. And the Latin epithets mean it's a beautiful crocus with a yellow throat. So what botanical science has done for us here is reduce the beauty of a thing like that to a straightforward, plodding description. It's a bonny crocus, that. So I'm reminded of Richard Feynman, now long dead, unfortunately, a significant and definitely creative physicist who could play bongo drums as well, who recounted this little tale that I've repeated for you here. And he finished up with that thing at the end. Science only adds. I don't understand how it subtracts. And I hope that strikes an echo with all the scientists who are watching me as I try to find my way through this web of naive and oversimplified thought. Science only adds. And having said that, of course, I admit that art may transcend science. Here's a painting from Turner, which was a searing criticism of the slave trade, throwing overboard the dead and dying slaves. So here, oils and morals combine in a way which science finds it hard to do. But equally, mathematics and science can transcend art. For here is a teeny portion of the Mandelbrot set, which is a fine piece of mathematics produced in the last century, which is capable of producing an infinite number of infinitely varied patterns, and this is only a teeny fraction of what can be done. There is no way in which artists working forever, a million artists working for a million years, could not produce the Mandelbrot set and its complexity. Art and science can actually converge. On the left, you've got Bridget Riley. You can go to Aberdeen Art Gallery and see a Bridget Riley, and she will make your head spin as you look at these patterns. Or you can just knock up a quick piece of code in Mathematica in 10 minutes and produce the same sort of thing, and it will make your head spin too. So you have to ask yourself, where is the difference between art and science in that? Of course, the difference is to some extent in the original notion of Bridget Riley. She uncovered what is already there, latent in the mathematics of sine waves. You can converge in the making of her patterns. Bridget Riley's patterns on the right, well, yes, very fine, very colourful. I like that sort of thing. Many don't. You can knock up the same sort of thing in 15 minutes with a bit of Mathematica coding on the left. What is the difference? The difference is that she conceived it and created it. And now, of course, I can be a pale imitator, but the end result really is not significantly different at all. There is a convergence of what can be done with science and maths. So I'm reaching my conclusion, which is fairly rapid. Few examples arbitrarily chosen. Beauty is everywhere. Yes, indeed it is. Cross the Forth Bridge, it's never the same. It's always the same. It's always got beauty. It's always got charm. You will learn that some pieces of prose are particularly beautiful. They're the ones that express eternal and pervasive truths, and here's one of them. There is sometimes discovered beauty. I return to mathematics here. Most of you will be familiar with the square root of -1, the symbols, the operators minus, plus, equals, the identities 0 and 1, the infinite expressions of the numbers e and pi, and you look at this mess and you think, how on earth are they related? That's a jumble. It's a set of building blocks. It's like looking in an old garage with pieces lying around, bits of maths chucked in the corner. The beauty, of course, comes when you put them together in Euler's relation, one equation using those symbols. In fact, I didn't need the minus. You get one simple equation which joins all those deeply incomprehensible things into one eternal truth. There again is a beauty which is tight, it is not loose. If you do computations, the computations are very logical. What you put into the algorithms, what you get out is in a sense predetermined, but the result can, and I repeat here, beautiful. This seen from a different direction of the previous shot. When form and function coincide, there too is beauty. Not many people find a gear wheel beautiful, but actually, the more you think about this gear wheel, what its form is, what its function is, the more beautiful it becomes. It's an expression of human creativity of immense depth that many of us take for granted or perhaps don't even think about. So I conclude the pictures by asserting again that beauty is indeed everywhere. When you look down the microscope, you will find it. You will find a beauty which you didn't know about before, which you can express, which you can share, which everybody can enjoy, scientist or humanist. So I finish up almost agreeing with the American philosopher Alan Bloom, who said this: that notion should unite scientists and literary intellectuals alike. And I do think that's extremely important. I have to say, I wish I'd known it 60 years ago. I might have been a more effective communicator and intellectual than I have been, but better late than never. So as a final thought, I came across this notion from Socrates, and I hope reading this that you will flatter yourselves and think to yourselves, yes, I'm a strong mind. I love to discuss ideas. I hope that's what you say to yourself. And you'll say, well, yes, there are some average minds who discuss events, seeking stimulation, in other words, from what other people do or what happens in the world. And then there are weak minds who discuss people, and in brackets, who read Hello magazine and live vicariously through the lives and loves of others. And that's all very attractive, that sort of simple aphorism that Socrates produced. And then I came across David's painting of the death of Socrates. And I thought, oh yes, there we are, there's Socrates giving a few final words to people. And I thought, what is David actually doing here? He's a humanist, an artist. What he's depicting is something about a person, an event in the person's life, and this person happened to be pretty strong on ideas. So actually David is discussing and unifying all those things, strong minds, average minds, weak minds, all in one picture, which made me think, having first been seduced by the aphorism of Socrates, made me think that we have to beware pithy aphorisms, we have to beware plausible generalities, and we certainly have to beware false polarities, which I suppose is my cautionary note. So everything that I've said, I hope you're skeptical about, but at least I hope I've given you some sort of viewpoint from which to answer my question, and I don't expect an answer from it now, but my question is meant to encourage you to think about creativity and beauty in your own work, because if you go down that route, you will be able to share your experiences better with those on the other side of the divide. And at that point, I think I've probably finished cudgeling my brain. It has not been easy for me, being a scientist, trying to tackle this theme, but I'm grateful for the stimulation I've received from the MAST's activities and from many colleagues throughout my career, really. So thank you all.
Thank you very much, Anton. And thank you for sharing your thoughts on this very elaborate subject. I feel like this is something for philosophers to talk about for a long time. Very interesting. And I feel like as you said, a lot of it has to do with perspective and the way we associate the things that we see with other things, and then maybe see the beauty in things. Yes, this is just a thought of mine. If we have a bit more time, if you or anyone would like to share an idea or thoughts on this, please feel free to just unmute yourself or post it in the chat. If you have questions, please do the same. I'm happy to read anything aloud that you would like to share. I have also just put a link in the chat because I found the article that you mentioned, Anton, about, I think it was resource, yes, and please feel free to have a look. Yes, Catherine.
Hi, as no one else is talking, I'll jump in, why not? That's really, really fascinating talk. Thank you so much. I guess I'm a philosopher that's come up through town planning and then moved over into the marine world. So yeah, there is a link there. It's all ethics and aesthetics. So yeah, I've been talking about the beauty of stuff for a while. I think what's really great about looking at the similarities between humanities and science, and I'll kind of leave social science out of it because sometimes it's seen as kind of the middle ground between the two, but they are all distinct, is that we're all coming at the same sort of problems from very different angles. And I think one thing that really struck me was when you were talking about the translations from other languages and losing the beauty in the Russian or the Chinese. That there's something about the role that humanities is doing and the role that science is doing as different sides of the same coin, and not reducing it to kind of one thing, which is I think what you were really kind of getting at as well. It's always great to hear about kind of getting people and all the kind of humanities subjects and all that kind of communication stuff into science. I think that's really, really good. I think the only thing that I would slightly guard against is using the humanities to further science. I think we need to be a bit more holistic than that. And I don't think that's what you were saying, but I think there is sometimes a slight risk that, not to be at all mean to my scientist colleagues, of going, well, I've got this idea and I want other people to know it. That's great. That's really great. And I want that as well. But to keep a little bit of the humanities back just for the sake of themselves. But that coupling and seeing all of these different ways of engaging with the world is equally important, I think is really critical. But yeah, thank you. Really good talk.
Thank you. I guess I go back to Feynman for that. Really, I think he would have agreed with you. He understood both sides and was particularly proficient in science, but it's worth looking at what he wrote because he was a great scientist. He wasn't one of the foot soldiers.
His book, thank you for reminding me of it because it's one of my absolute favorites.
You, Catherine. Mike, you have a question.
Mm. But, thanks and greetings, Anton. Great to see you. Great to see you looking well as well. Yeah, you've come a long way since looking at the hydrodynamics of Scottish sea lochs, and I'm just pondering whether the university education now of science and humanities, whether it's become so formulaic, so prescriptive that students today are not exposed to these ideas. But even discussions of Karl Popper and Peter Medawar and so on what science is and what is the methods of science, and I just get the impression that students now, they're so busy, certainly in the sciences, having all this all the facts drilled into them, and all the courses have to be run to, and I use the word formulaic, they have to be run to strict formulae, that I don't think they get a chance to take their minds in the directions that you have doing. I think we might be in danger of squeezing some of that, some of the links that you've mentioned, squeezing this out of education, higher education. So I don't think scientists are exposed to the things you're talking about, humanities, and I don't think the humanities students get a chance to get exposed to these ideas. But that might just be the way education is developed.
I am glad to see you too. We're both still here.
Good point. Yes.
And as Thomas More said, we still own the earth underneath our feet, which is something to be very grateful for. You mentioned Popper and Medawar. Somehow at that stage of my life, I wasn't interested in what Popper and Medawar said. They seemed to be speaking from a remote platform that in previous ages might have discussed whether Christ had a purse or how many angels you could get on a pinhead. But that was my naivety, I'm sure. So I never found them engaging. And what occurs to me as you comment and ask your question is that a lot of this viewpoint on things, for me anyway, seems to have come from inside. I've always had bits and pieces of enjoying these things inside me, and I was really grateful for the opportunity to express them and externalize them here in a way that I have never done before. What you're talking about, however, is exposing students to an external influence which would come in on them rather than coming out of them. And I'm a little distrustful of that way of teaching things. I mean, going back to the previous comments, it would be nice to leave something of the humanities unanalyzed, unsynthesized, so it could be itself and come to people from their own experience. I can't say any more, really. I need to think more about that. But it's good. It's a good point.
Yeah.
One thing I would add is that I do feel that students now, well, yes, students largely younger than you and me, they do get a much more contextual view of the science that they're dealing with. We do hear so much more now, if I take our subject of marine studies, so much more about the social implications, the management of the oceans, all that contextual material which was lacking really in the 1960s and 70s when one learnt about the sea and its processes. Now we learn what seemed desirable to many of us at that time, more of the context. But parallel with that, when I listen to conferences and I read some papers, I feel that what has been driven out by the increased emphasis on the social, economic, and managerial context, what has been driven out is the detail of the understanding of the natural processes.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
there hasn't been so much time to spend on them.
Yeah.
And also because some of them have already been discovered, so they lack novelty and excitement.
Yeah.
But that's probably another theme we're talking about.
Yeah.
I'll shut up.
Yeah, I mean, just very briefly, and then I'll let Ezra come in. I mean, by the same token, you could argue that by take the life sciences in biology, a move towards more and more molecular biology, where I just get the impression we're so keen now to get an organism into a test tube and analyze its DNA to the nth degree, which you touched on, that we're actually forgetting to look at what the organism is like, what it does, and what that overall beauty is. It's what people disparagingly call, well, if you want to look at the organisms like that, that's natural science, isn't it? That's natural history. When actually we're saying, yeah, but we don't know enough about these organisms. We might now know their genome, but do we know how they move and sort of feed and things like that? So I think we are losing some. But anyway, better let Ezra come in. But thanks for the talk. Very interesting. Great stuff.
Thank you, Mike. It is 2 right now. We still have one question, I think. Ezra, if you like to pose your questions. Everyone else, if you have to go other places, thank you for joining us today. But I think we have some time for this last question.
Hello, that was an amazing talk, Edward. Thank you so much. I just wondered what role can or does religion play in science and humanities? Are there any contradictions? Are there any affirmations? How were you able to look into that a little bit, or your views? Welcome, thank you.
I'm delighted that you picked up on that, really, because I think in my list of human affairs and attributes and activities, I did mention spiritual matters. And spiritual matters, it seems to me, are an inevitable part of the human makeup. I have not thought about such things deeply because I have never been anything of a theist. I think it was Descartes said he had no need of that concept. The world seems to work quite well without the addition of the spiritual deity. But you have to recognize that a lot of people seek a transcendental meaning in events, particularly, and in people, and in ideas even. And I have met scientists who are, well, I can think of one who was deeply Christian, and inasmuch as his Christianity extended to the way in which we treat each other and treat the natural world, that seemed entirely consistent with the science that he pursued. And I think that's probably true in my very limited experience of other religions too. I think that there is very often to be found a respect for the natural world, which is what many of us here share. There's a respect for the environment that supports and shapes us, and for which we have some responsibility. And I think that if that goes through the medium, let's say, of a God, then it's only to the good of the world and the way we behave. And that really is as far as I would go. I haven't thought so deeply that I can offer you a tray full of reliable thoughts.
Thank you very much, Anton. Thank you for those questions. We're a little over the time, and thanks for everyone who still joined us today. It was a very lovely presentation, and wish you a very nice rest of the week and of the day, and see you at another SMMR webinar shortly. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye.